So, Archer Cat was such a big meme back in the days. It probably really was one of the biggest memes in Battle Cats for the longest time. You couldn't go 2 seconds in any Battle Cats community without ever seeing an Archer Cat joke. Archer Cat so OP, Archer Cat so broken, I win the entire game with just Archer Cat solo. It's straight up inescapable. It's pretty ironic that I was one of those people that actually got tired of Archer Cat meme, and yet I was someone who contributed to that meme a couple of years ago. I mean, you gotta admit, the Archer Cat meme, as annoying as it was, definitely was one of the most iconic thing in Battle Cats community. People made a massive deal out of Archer, making fan arts and joke posts about him all the time. A user by the name Harbich even made an entire Mega Man styled fan game out of Archer Cat. As of the making of this video, I never actually played this game. I probably should stream it, but nowadays not a lot of people actually see Archer Cat memes anymore, but remnants of those definitely still exist. Many players who've been around for a long time already knows this, but some newer player might not really know why was Archer Cat a meme. And really the reason was simple, because Archer Cat at one point was arguably one of the worst units in the game. And remember, this was back in the boomer meta where we used basically any terrible units because we always find ways to use any trash units for the worst strats possible. And yet even on those times, Archer Cat was still considered to be a meme. So you can imagine that he really was a really bad unit. Archer Cat is a unit who relies on having good stats to work. It's a unit with massive damage against floating enemies, and yet every bit of his stats is really bad. His health is very low and any semi-strong hits would kill him in one shot. His damage is really below average, even including his massive damage ability into account, and he is very costly for what he's worth. The only thing that's actually kind of decent is his range. 340 is pretty high for a rare unit, but still majority of the time you're better off just using like Dragon Cat. If your Dragon Cat's not true formed yet, then yeah, Archer Cat might have slight damage advantage when against floating enemies, but even then, if you have Dragon Cat's true form, King Dragon Cat straight out has basically about as good of a damage to floating enemies than Archer Cat. Not to mention, Dragon Cat's range is 400 compared to Archer's 340. Even if you boost Archer a bit high, or not have King Dragon Cat, Archer still has a lot of very heavy competition. You know who else has a standing range that is as close as him? It's Paris Cat, arguably one of the strongest units in the game for a long time in the early game meta. I have a whole video explaining about Paris Cat and Cyborg Cat if you want to learn more about her too. With how powerful Paris is, Archer just could not really find any reason to be used. Paris was dominating the meta, so it's pretty ironic that even back then when the meta was just stacking up range attackers, Archer Cat, who actually has range, was still not really worth bringing because his stats was just really not worth the cost. There's so little reason to actually bring Archer Cat or to use Archer Cat when units like Paris Cat and Dragon Cat basically outshines him in every way. And so eventually, when his true form finally rolls out, people start wondering, perhaps is he finally stopped going to become a meme? Well, Archer Cat's true form, Katar, is, well, it's alright. I mean, he got basically what he needed. His health is increased and his damage is increased, his range is also increased. That's really all he ever wanted, really. Finally, he's able to do more than just being a joke. His effective damage against floating is actually pretty respectable and notably higher than the likes of Dragon Cat or whatever his other competitions are. Plus, his 390 range now is actually very solid. He used to have trouble outranging certain floating enemies, and this extra range actually allows him to outrange a lot more enemies. And overall just gives him better survivability. When you're in a floating focus stage, he's actually a pretty respectable replacement for Dragon Cat. So things are looking pretty solid for Cataur. And yet despite this, his stats are still a little bit lacking. Even with his stat buff, his health is still pretty low. Any semi-strong hits from enemies would still kill him in at least 1 or 2 shots. He's also still relatively pricey for units that's only single target, and not to mention only having 1 typing. If there are any non-floating enemies that is in front of his trait target, then his damage is completely wasted on those non-floating enemies. You're going to have to get rid of those enemies using whatever other units that you have, or else he basically always constantly just deal 1/4 of his potential damage, which is really bad. So his competitions are still very tight, and he has a lot of competition still. Competitions that are ready to steal his thunder, like War. It's like some kind of Speaking of that, let me tell you about War Thunder, today's sponsor. War Thunder is a massive yet easily comprehensible vehicle combat game for PC, console, and mobile device. It's only $80. Just kidding, it's free to play. Use over 2,500 different types of tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships from many different nations. Control common and obscure vehicles from biplanes to various tanks throughout history. War Thunder is incredibly detailed and realistic, not just in terms of graphics and sound effects, but the way bullet ricochet and vehicle interior works gets incredibly detailed. It's like simulating real life. If you're into military history and vehicles, this is the game for you. Join the other 95 million players in War Thunder's worldwide community in active and engaging PvP battles today. Sign up with my links in the pinned comments or video description down below. If you're a new player or haven't played in 6 months, you'll receive a massive bonus pack on PC or consoles containing the Eagle of Valor, an exclusive vehicle decorator, as well as a 100,000 Silver Lions and premium account for 7 days. Offer is available for a limited amount of time, so sign up now. Remember, it's free to play. Thank you War Thunder for sponsoring this video, and now back to Cat Game. Anyways, as I was saying, Cataur has a lot of competition in being not just anti-floating range attacker in general, but just being a range attacker in general. In a lot of situations, Dragon Cat would still be a pretty good replacement for him, simply because Dragon Cat does not care about enemy traits. Majority of stages in Battle Cats are mixed trait stages, so only having one trait focus is not really a good look. Meanwhile, Dragon Cat that does not rely on having ability to actually deal damage will always deliver the same amount of decent damage regardless of whatever traits he's attacking. Plus, Dragon Cat, especially in his true form, actually have a really good amount of health. He can take quite a beating and will always reposition using his 3 knockback counts, unlike Cataur, which might sometimes just die in one shot. Sure, Dragon Cat is slightly more expensive, but given his grander survivability, it does make him relatively more cost efficient in staying in the field longer. To make matters worse, only 3 updates later, he gains a very heavy competition in the floating department because of Mercat's true form, Cameraman Cat. Cameraman in her true form is a spammable anti-floating mid-ranger with extremely good survivability, low cooldown, and very good cost efficiency as well. She survives for a great amount of time and she deals a pretty good amount of damage. She has area attack, she has basically advantage over Cataur in almost every way. The only thing she's lacking is range. But lacking range is not that big of a problem when it comes to Cameraman, because most of the time the most threatening floating enemies are Bun Bun variants, and Cameraman already outranges Bun Bun, so there's very little reason to actually use Cataur over Cameraman, especially when you're fighting a Bun Bun stage. Even with the range advantage, Cataur's usages are still kind of limited. He does have advantage in range, so he can deal with slightly higher floating enemies like Owlbrow or Moot slightly easier, or can survive better in some mixed trait stage that has enemies that can threaten lower range units. But a lot of the times when dealing with these sort of problems, players can just use higher range generalists or legend units like Bahamut or Ururun instead. Not only do these units have area attack and proper good range, again they also don't rely on having target trait ability to actually get their damage done. No matter how much mixed traits are there in the stage, they'll always deal consistent damage. Cataur's reliance on his massive damage ability and only having one trait target and single target makes it very hard for him to actually deliver his full potential. At this point, Cataur's not exactly like a meme anymore. I mean, he's certainly not Archer Cat, but he's not exactly faring that much better either. Still, despite his flaws, he does have usages thanks to his good range and damage. At level 30, his effective DPS, if you have the full alien treasure, would be around 4,000-ish, and for a 390 range rare unit with pretty good cooldown, that's actually pretty good. As long as you can protect him and allow him to stack up, his damage can ramp up pretty noticeably high. Sure, it might be a little hard to show his proper usages sometimes, but with the right enemy and the right situation, he can contribute in destroying some floating enemies really quickly. The community in general still recognize him at least being usable. It's not that much of a meme, but he's not that amazing of a unit either, and that's just how Cataur was perceived for a while. That is, until he got another chance. Talents. Talents was a really big deal when it comes to giving units second chances. A lot of units get some pretty insane usages and unlocks way better potential thanks to talents, so the prospects of Cataur getting talents are pretty exciting. But it is also a little bit terrifying because a lot of bad units end up getting terrible talents, which really does not help at all, and since they already got talents, it kind of just dooms them to complete obscurity. But miraculously, Cataur was actually one of the few lucky ones that got a set of talents that were actually pretty good. The main talents that he got were Target Zombie and Zombie Killer. These talents are a little odd to say the least. Most of the zombie enemies that we face are melee enemies, and a lot of the time it's actually much better to nuke down those zombie enemies with either melee anti-zombie or just melee units in general. Even units like Can or Manic Island, which does not have Zombie Killer, can help a lot in dealing with zombies. You usually want to just deal with zombies fast, so even without Z Killer, if you have high damage output, you're usually just better against zombies regardless. Cataur, however, is a ranged unit that kind of relies on getting stacked up to deal damage over time. It's not particularly like a nuker or anything, so he's not really amazing to deal with majority of the zombies in the game because, again, majority of the times you want to kill these zombie enemies quickly, and Cataur, while he does have pretty good damage for what range he has, since a lot of zombie enemies are melee, that range advantage does not really shine that much. Cataur's not really that kind of unit. Not to mention, in some scenarios, Cataur being a generic range attackers are prime target for most zombie enemies that burrows. Certain zombie enemies that burrows like Ziggy or Zori or Zumbo generally burrows just far enough to hit your range attacker units. Cataur's 390 range is prime target for a lot of these zombie enemies. Even with his true form giving him better health, some zombie enemies just hits pretty hard. If he's not boosted enough, he can just die in one hit. Maybe maximum 2 if he's slightly boosted up, but his survivability is very questionable against a lot of zombie enemies. And yet even then, he's still actually somewhat respectable. Back then, there was a very little amount of anti-zombie units that actually deals good amount of damage. It took a while until proper zombie damage dealers like Little Flying Cat even came out, so Cataur's zombie targeting, even though it's not really particularly optimal, it's still pretty good for what it's worth. Besides, you can still get quite a mileage out of Cataur's range, especially against higher range zombies like Gravy. Gravy is a tanky mid-ranger enemy that's mostly there to block your way while also disrupting melee units because of his knockback ability. Cataur is one of the few units that can actually outrange Gravy, and so because of Cataur's range and the fact that Gravy doesn't really push that hard, he is perfect for Gravy. Cataur can safely stack up in front of Gravy, and due to his relatively short cooldown and good range, he can stack up pretty quickly and potentially just mow down Gravy with record speed if you have enough stack of him. If there are other zombies in the stage, then he might require a little bit of protection from your other units, but if you keep the stack alive, he really can shred those zombies pretty quickly. Cataur does have a little bit of competition when it comes to fighting Gravy, and that is with Volter Cat. Volter is also another stackable range anti-zombie unit. Her anti-zombie ability is to slow zombies, therefore her damage is actually not as high as Cataur, but to compensate, she have pretty notably higher health and also area attack, and especially the long distance ability, which allows her to potentially hit much further away. Yeah, her raw damage output isn't as good as Cataur, but the fact is she has LD and area attack allows her to be much more consistent in her damage output, and she doesn't really need to fear of any peons that will be blocking her way. She does still need a little bit of support to deal with some other zombie enemies that can burrow under her, but she's not as frail as Cataur, so you don't really need Cataur's zombie talents to deal with Gravy. But you know what zombie enemy that Cataur can counter and Volter cannot? That's right, it's Cadaver Bear. Cadaver Bear is quite a deadly enemy. It is a bearic variant that attacks extremely fast and generally needs to be dealt with as quickly as possible. Cadaver Bear has 360 range, outranging Volter's 350 but not Volter's LD. If you have proper stepping stone in front of Cadaver, then Volter would be able to snipe him down. And in those situations, if there are enemies in front of Cadaver Bear, then Cataur might have some trouble actually hitting Cadaver Bear at the first place. But sometimes there might be times where Cadaver Bear might be alone, or you simply don't really have a proper stepping stone to deal with Cadaver Bear, and in that case Cataur would be one of the best way to deal with him, at least in non-Uber side, but you know. Cataur with his 390 range is able to outrange Cadaver Bear. If stacked up, can still deal quite a lot of damage to it, but unfortunately it's not exactly as easy as it sounds. Cadaver Bear pushes really hard. This guy hits pretty hard and attacks extremely fast too. If your Cataurs get hit, they will die. Not to mention, if there are other peons in front of Cadaver, then you'll need to clear those off first since Cataur is single target. And there's still the problem of if there are other zombie enemies in the stage, then you would still need someone to clear those off. Of course, Cataur still works, but he does require a lot of support here and there. And I know I don't really sound like I'm selling Cataur for you at all. Some people might actually just ask at this point, it's like, why even bother using Cataur for Cadaver Bear at the first place? It sounds like such a hassle. Why do people even still use this guy? Well, the answer is simple, because we simply have not much other choices. choices, especially for no-Uber players. If you filter units by non-Uber anti-zombie unit with zombie killer ability, and then you sort it by highest range, then Cataur would be at the top of the list, only beaten by like a Bikuriman collab that has like 200 DPS, but let's ignore that. But aside from her, Cataur is really the only unit that can actually outrange Cadaver Bear. This has been the case for years, and this has not changed since Cataur got his zombie talent. When it comes to non-Uber, Cataur is the single one and only non-Uber anti-zombie killer unit that actually outranges Cadaver Bear. Literally the only one, so you really don't have that much other choices. I'm not saying that people only use Cataur because it's the only choice and that's it, because Cataur is still pretty good. I might sound like a broken record, but I do really need to remind you guys that despite all his flaws, he still has pretty good potential and damage. With the right situation, he can mow down Cadaver Bear pretty fast. Sure, maybe half the reason people use him is out of necessity, but he does his job pretty well. That being said, I think the fact that Cataur's zombie target are from talents makes a lot of players not actually want to get them. A lot of players would try to find a reason to not get them as much as possible. I mean, NP are scarce, so I kinda understand that people don't really want to spend it unless they absolutely have literally no other choices. Instead, most players would just burn their NP on Ubers. I know y'all just love to burn NP on Ubers. But anyways, point is, people always try to find a way to not use Cataur as much as possible because it costs NP. So of course, there are still alternatives when it comes to dealing with Cadaver Bear. One of those, and is actually probably a unit that nobody really uses either, is actually Awakened Musashi. Awakened Musashi have enough range to outrange Cadaver Bear and has Zombie Killer too. But I feel like there are less people that remember this fact than those that would actually want to use Cataur's zombie target, so maybe this one don't matter that much. But I do know some players that actually use Musashi as an anti-Cadaver Bear unit back in the day, so there's that. And I've already mentioned this, but Volter is still kind of usable against Cadaver Bear in certain situations, as long as she has a stepping stone. But you know what the crazy thing is? Probably his biggest competitions, well, aside from Ubers obviously, are not even anti-zombies at the first place. Cataur's toughest competitions are simply the special legend units, and obviously Ubers. But even in terms of like no Uber, straight up, the special legend units, especially the Awakened one, like Awakened Ururin and Mina, that is Cataur's biggest competition when it comes to Cadaver Bear. These special legend units are pretty solid in stats, to the point where they can deal with Cadaver Bear pretty well. But hold on, you might say, they don't even have zombie killers, right? I mean, sure, Ururun technically have zombie target, but she doesn't have zombie killer, so why would you use them? Well, that's true. If you don't zombie kill Cadaver Bear, then Cadaver Bear would revive. Then in that case, just kill him again. Cadaver Bear survive aren't infinite, so if you play right, you can just kill Cadaver Bear again. Sure, it'll probably take much longer, but the process of killing Cadaver Bear with these units are way simpler. So some players really would rather to just fight Cadaver Bear twice than actually using Cataur. On top of that, after a while, Holy Blast is also a thing that exists. Holy Blast, the custom cannon that can take off zombie health by percentage, is stupidly powerful. If you time your Holy Blast cannon right, you're able to basically zombie kill any zombie enemies in the game without ever bringing any Z killers in your lineup. It can be rather difficult, but a skilled and experienced player is able to snipe down zombie enemies pretty easily, especially with a higher level Holy Blast. So you can use your special legend units to just chip down Cadaver Bear as much as possible, and then when he's about to die, you can snipe him off with Holy Blast, allowing you to counter Cadaver Bear without actually needing to spend 100 NP. To be fair, Holy Blast is very stupid. It is unbelievably broken, so it is quite a tough competition. Despite that, I would still consider Cataur to be a pretty good unit at this point. I mean, sure, he's not exactly a necessary unit to have, but like, given the fact that the whole game can be beaten with like the same 8 units, you could argue that like 99% of the units in the game are unnecessary. But you don't need to be necessary to be a good unit, you know? Cataur is still one of the only few anti-zombie range attackers, so he's not as easily replaceable and still does pretty well on his job. Even outside of zombies, his floating targets still get some mileage here and there. He might not be the best at bun buns, but when there are multiple high range enemies in the stage, he could perform better than Cameraman at times, or just work alongside her to cover each other's weakness. The footage you're seeing in the back right now is 3 Crowns Lord Lecture, which honestly was one of the harder UL stages at High Crown. The stage starts off with a bunch of little bun buns and some mid-high range alien floating enemies, and eventually a bun bun symbiote will come out. You can split the task to allow Camera to deal with the little bun buns, and then afterwards use Cataur to deal with everything else. They both both excel in completely different situations. Cameraman would not really be able to deal with some of the higher range floating enemies, but Cataur absolutely can. Cataur might not be able to deal with the swarm of little bun-buns, but Cameraman absolutely can. They don't necessarily replace each other, sometimes they can just complete each other. How romantic. I don't think anybody actually ships Cataur and Cameraman though, but if someone makes like ship art of them, ping me on Twitter. In fairness though, this footage of Lord's lecture you're seeing right now, I think half of the work is actually thanks to Necrodancer, so might not be the absolute best showcase, but hey. Well, that, and this is also a showcase for how good full research combo is. Research combo is just that good, which is why I made a whole video about it, which you should watch if you're interested. Speaking of usages, shout out to that one time where I did the final Legrim Gauntlet stage by using 9 meat shields and Cataur, because all of the enemies in the stage actually gets countered by Cataur's good standing range. It is a very funny run, but don't try this at home, this took like 20 minutes to beat. Well, a lot of the things I've been saying are kind of somewhat outdated, you might think, because this has not really changed in a while. Cataur, and a lot of other rare units for that matter, has not really gotten any changes or any buffs at all over the years. He still gets some usages here and there if there are Gravy or Cadaver bears, but otherwise he's not really getting any more relevant either. So how is he nowadays anyways? Well, you want the good news or the bad news? Well, okay, the bad news is unfortunately his anti-floating niche has been almost entirely replaced with the addition of Bubble Cat, the true form of Miasma. Bubble is also a ranged anti-floating and anti-angel unit with a very solid range. Although Bubble also have mediocre health, Bubble have LD and area attack with stupidly high damage output and very cheap cost. Remember how Volter was a competition when it comes to anti-zombie? Well, at least Volter has a pretty significantly lower damage than Cataur, but Bubble's damage is really high, since he has the massive damage ability against floating enemies. There are a few enemies that Bubble cannot outrange that Cataur can, but Bubble's LD makes it extremely easy for him to actually hit those enemies and just shred them into pieces. Bubble is kind of a late game-ish drop unit, but it's not that crazy hard to get either, so once you get it, it's a bit hard to justify Cataur's usage against floating stages. And as for zombies, well, that would be actually the good news, because he's actually doing pretty fine. Over the years, like I've mentioned, there hasn't been any new units or forms that takes over Cataur's role as a ranged anti-zombie unit, especially against Cadaver Bear. And if he's allowed to stack up, he can still mow down Gravy super fast. His competition Volter did get the Savage Blow talent, which makes her damage output way higher though. It's still not as high as Cataur, but it is high enough for her to be basically your main go-to generalist when it comes to dealing with some zombie enemies, without a lot of the weakness that Cataur has, like the single target or the reliance on his massive damage ability. Still, if the situation allows him, Cataur can still contribute a lot when it comes to dealing with some zombie stages. He might not necessarily replace Volter, but he can work together side by side with Volter to deal with some zombie stages way better. Cataur still have many valid reasons to be used, and on top of that, something recent actually allows him to be much more relevant too. That is, simply because of the addition of a new enemy, Oldstrich. Oldstrich is a zombie variant of Arost, and Arost is one of the most hated enemies in the game. Oldstrich is a mid-ranger pusher with high damage as well as a chance to do toxic on your units, and it's also a sage, meaning that he does not get easily debuffed with status effects. To make it even scarier, Oldstrich as a zombie has infinite revives, so if you don't Z-kill him, he will always stay on the field. So you get where I'm going with this. Cataur is actually a really good counter for Oldstrich. Cataur stands at a pretty safe range and deals pretty good damage towards it. And Oldstrich isn't as scary as Cadaver Bear. His range is noticeably lower, so Cataur doesn't get killed that fast. Sure, you can use units like Volter and KFC to also deal damage towards Oldstrich, but again, you can just use Cataur side by side along with them, because Cataur's damage is still noticeably superior. Yeah, Cataur still has his problem. He's still single target, he's still awfully frail, he still heavily relies on other units' protection to actually work, but if you can protect Cataur well and make way for Cataur to get clear shot, then he can contribute extremely well on bursting down Oldstrich. You might say it's a lot of ifs, yeah, but it works. I mean, Battle Cats is supposed to be a team building strategy game anyways. Your units are supposed to work together. Cataur might be somewhat of a needy unit, but that doesn't really take away his value either. Most units in Battle Cats need some sort of support to help them win. Some units are more independent compared to others, but it's not entirely a bad thing for a unit to be dependent on other units, as long as they show results, then that's all that matters. And Cataur does show results. It might not be spectacular, it might not be like super crazy, amazing, powerful, broken, must-have units or whatever, but he shows results. And frankly, that's really all you need to be a good enough unit. Well, maybe that also raises another question. Is Cataur really a good unit? I mean, I asked you guys in a community post recently about what your thoughts on Archer Cat is, and majority of the player pretty much says, he sucks and I never really use him. And I completely understand where that came from. Cataur's stats is, to put it simply, very outdated. His health is really low, his damage is alright, but not amazing, and he's only single target. He doesn't really get any of the newer modern abilities or resistance or whatnot. And yet, despite all that, he still has his usages, and he has a niche that doesn't easily get replaced. He has proper reason to be used, and if you have a proper reason to be used, that's really all you need. He performs pretty well too. I've actually basically used him in every single Oldstrich stages that I've come across, except for like one. And this is not even for like the sake of this video. Majority of these lineups are just straight up my first clears, and I've used Cataurs in basically almost every single one of these Oldstrich stages. Cataur does put in work, that's all that matters. He just don't really got enough stages where he works, if that makes sense. Most zombie stages are more fitting for short-range zombie killers, and Cataur being not great at these stages doesn't mean exactly that he's an objectively bad unit. It's simply not his niche, it's as simple as that. Sure, you could argue that if he's stronger, then he could be usable for more zombie stages, like, you know, if he has better damage, then he could also be good for countering these melee zombies. But if he does already have that massive power, then aren't you just taking the job of already existing good anti-melee zombies? Say, units like Cadaver Bear Cat and Cat Chief are known to be one of the best anti-zombies in the game, but they don't really work on higher range zombie enemies like Cadaver Bear or Gravy. Does that make these units bad? No, it's just not their niche, and that's completely fine. Cataur's niche just so happens to be more narrow than most. That being said, I think there are very good reasons for this like mindset on a lot of players. Units like Cadaver Bear and Cat Chief are much more well known, not just because they work in more zombie stages, but also, well, because their job is not as easily replaceable by Ubers. Most anti-zombie Ubers are high-range units. Almost all of the well-known anti-zombie Ubers are units that can outrange Cadaver Bear and Gravy, but at the same time, they're usually not great against a lot of the melee zombies, which is why Cadaver and Cat Chief are used more. Meanwhile, Cataur, being a range anti-zombie unit, is absolutely replaceable by most anti-zombie Ubers. Majority of Battle Cats players aren't going to restrict themselves to no Uber or anything, and if you have proper range anti-zombie Ubers like Dreadnought or Terme, then you probably won't really rely on Cataur. Not just for the idea that Cataur is quote-unquote bad, but also the idea that Cataur is not an Uber, and therefore people would really rather just use Ubers than non-Ubers. Because there are actually some stages where I'd argue Cataur can perform better than some of these Ubers, especially on stages like Infernal Towers Floor 27, but most Ubers will usually work good enough for most players on most stages, enough to justify themselves to not get or use Cataur's zombie ability. I still really like Cataur though. I really like how Cataur is balanced, honestly. I think he's currently one of the best balanced units in Battle Cats, and I hope it stays that way. He works perfectly fine in his niche without being too strong or too weak, and isn't easily replaceable either. I really hope that Cataur don't get replaced because I really like where he stands right now. It is very interesting the fact that Cataur has not really received any changes for a very long time, and yet his relevancy has gone back up in the most recent years simply by the addition of Oldstrich. Not by that much, but it is up, and he doesn't even need any new abilities or Ultra Form or Ultra Talons or anything like that. He simply gains relevancy because of a new enemy. And I think that's something really cool to think about, because I've seen a lot of people that try to make like a fan-made Ultra Talons or fan-made Ultra Form to their beloved units, only to make them really not that much better in terms of usages. I mean, it makes them better in what they're already good at, but outside of that, it doesn't really give anything newer or interesting. So maybe instead of giving them buffs to their favorite units, instead maybe they should invent a new enemy. Who knows? But yeah, I just think that Cataur's evolution over the years has been very interesting. He went from a meme to a bad unit, but not a meme, to actually respectable, to somewhat losing relevancy again, and now back to being just relevant enough. He didn't exactly went from a 0 to hero, he just became not 0, and sometimes sometimes that's enough. Have you ever had a point in your life where you're feeling like you're completely useless? And maybe you look up to someone and you feel like you want to be the most important person in the world, or some super famous and successful businessman or influencer or whatever. But really, sometimes all you need is to just have some sort of meaning. You don't need to be super exceptional and amazing to be happy in life. As long as you have value, as long as you have meaning, well, that's enough, isn't it? I mean, sure, you can shoot for more, but it's not really necessary, isn't it? Maybe you just need to appreciate what value you already have. And sometimes just that little bit of value is enough. That's all I wanted to say, I think, for now. If you have any thoughts or questions or any opinions on Cataur, share them down below in the comments. Yeah, we were talking about Battlecats and not just life advice. And thanks again for War Thunder for sponsoring the video. Remember, it's free to play on PC, mobile, and consoles, and you can get the bonus pack if you click on the links down below in the pinned comments or description. Also, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, join my membership, and like wing and ding that bell or whatever. I make a lot of Battlecats content or talk about some various indie games too, so if you're interested, be sure to check those out. And that's about it. I'll catch you another time. See ya.